Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, hi, hello, welcome. I am Sherilyn and I'm so glad you found me. If you're not new here, welcome back to our Rewind Wednesday. Thank you for being here every week and hanging out with me. I missed you guys last week and I know that I said I was going to be back this week with a two-parter, but in light of the discovery at the residential school in Kamloops last week, I want to shed light on what's going on there and I will have the two-parter for you next week. Before getting into today's story, I just want to preface with the fact that what I'm talking about is just a speck of the injustice that's been done to our Indigenous communities. There's so much to be learned, and if it's something that you are interested in learning, I just wanted to let you know, if you didn't know already, the UofA is offering a free course on Indigenous Canada. So you can take it online, it's all for free, and really dive into all of the history there. I want to be a better ally. I want to be better educated on everything. So I'm really looking forward to just, pouring myself into all of that history there. So I'm going to leave a link for you if you are also interested in learning for yourselves. Also, if you are wanting to support a charity, I'm going to leave a link to the one that we donated to last year and plan on donating to this year. All right, let's get into it. Before we do, I do want to let you know there will be references to awful acts that involve children, including physical, sexual abuse, torture, death. If that is too heavy for you, I will see you in another video. All right, if everything I'm saying to you right now is sounding foreign and you haven't heard, over a week ago, there was 215 bodies of children that were found on the property of a residential school in Kamloops, BC. This is something that I've actually been researching and had in the works for quite a while. It actually started when I was looking into a certain story that involved a conspiracy theory. This was about 6 months ago. As I got Khaleesi. Okay, you can't blow it that those are fake candles. Come sit with me. Apologies. Granted, there is part of this that is going to remain a conspiracy theory that involves a visit from the Queen and Prince Philip. We'll get into that. But what I was seeing when I was researching was that anybody who was speaking up about the fact that there were mass graves with children that had just disappeared on residential school property, they were met with a lot of backlash. They were called liars. Allegedly, there were searches that were done and they never came up with anything. So there was no truth behind what people were trying to bring attention to, is what I was, reading at this time. So even though I felt like, who are we to discredit the stories of all of these people who are sharing this horror, I was scared. So I ended up calling my sister and I was just losing it, and we just both decided maybe hold off, gather a little bit more, and we'll go from there. And I feel like it's sad that we're kind of in that time right now. I do realize the importance of not spreading false information and just getting certain groups really riled up and a tale just completely spinning and getting out of control. But I feel like what happens in some of these cases where something really, really horrible happens and it's just beyond comprehension that it could ever go down, especially by people of authority who we are supposed to trust and follow, you just automatically close off and you're just nope. In this case particular, nobody wants to believe that their government or their churches or the RCMP or the royals would have a hand in gruesome acts involving children. But here we are. So I figure all I can really do is share what I've read, share what we know that's going on right now, and just hope that more truths come out, more awareness comes out of this, and there's accountability brought forward to what happened and what continues to happen within our Indigenous communities. I think the first place we can start here in terms of what we're talking about in this video is residential school. And if you don't know what a residential school is, they were schools that were run by the Catholic Catholic Church with the purpose of wiping out the Indigenous community. That's the easiest way I can say it. And the way they wanted to do it was just abolish any speck of their language, culture, or traditions. And they do this by having the RCMP go to the reserves, force their way into people's houses, usually at gunpoint, and then take their children out of their arms. I can't imagine. Like, it's one thing to just say those words, but just stop for a second and just try to imagine sitting in your home. You've got your babies terrified because you can hear what's about to come through your door. Someone forces their way in, steals your child who's 3, 4 years old, and just like that, they're gone. It's just gut-wrenching to think about the fear that that child would feel in those moments, being ripped away from their families. I mean, if you've had a child in childcare, you know how devastating that first drop-off can be. You know, you're trying to pass off your baby or your toddler to this daycare person who they don't really know, and they're just like screaming and clawing for you to come back through the doors and come for them. And, you know, we know at the end of the day, we're going to go back and we're going to get them and all is going to be okay. But those little children had that feeling and it never went away. Their parents weren't allowed to come and pick them up. And then for the parent, I mean, how many of us just sit in our cars and cry for a good hour before we're able to leave the parking lot because we can't see through our eyes because they're full of tears. And we know our kids are safe. You know, they're eventually going to be okay. They're going to start playing with their friends. All is good. But these parents, they don't know that. They know that not all is good. And at the end of the day, their children aren't coming home to them. Not only that, but they're gone to an institution that is designed to just desecrate who they are and where they came from. An institution where an estimated 6,000 children died. And if you did survive, it wasn't because, you know, you were lucky and you were favored. You survived. You survived beatings. You survived experiments. You survived assaults. You survived watching your siblings and your friends die right in front of you. These were institutions where if you were caught speaking your own language, you were tortured. And the point of it was to just kill off an entire culture. I mean, first question you have is, why would somebody do this? I think that is part of a little bit of the denial, right? I think a lot of things that we're hearing right now is like, oh, this was just a piece of history. It didn't really go down like that. The governments apologized. They were compensated financially. And these cop-outs, they try to like turn and misdirect the attention as to what actually happened here and why and what went on. And there's no answers. And nobody wants to, you know, admit fault, admit that they were a part of horror, and admit that the reason this happened was because the Indigenous people are freaking badass, man. They lived by their own rules. They didn't need direction from the government. They didn't need to follow the teachings of the Catholic Church. They had their own traditions. They had their own cultures. They found this land, baby, and deep down, authorities knew that they were strong people. They were threatened by their way of life. They were threatened by their ability of survival and their strong, tight communities. And what do you do when you're threatened by somebody? You try to break them down. The process is just false intentions. It's like, oh, this will be good for everybody. Like, come to our schools. Let's just, you know, mingle in perfect harmony. We'll teach you a little bit about the way that we do things. And this is just going to be, you know, easy for communication and livelihood all around. They don't mention the part about the intention is to destroy their culture. So initially, you know, it was looked at as like, okay, yeah, maybe this is a good idea. You know, let's work together. And then when the Indigenous people started to realize, you know, what's going on in these schools and what the real motive was, it was too late for them to stop that wheel from spinning. By that point, it had turned into law that their children needed to go to these institutions. And if they didn't, the parents were sent to jail. And if they still refused and were like, cool, send me to jail, like you're not taking my child, that's when they really had no choice because the RCMP would come at gunpoint and take the kids anyway. When the children got to these residential schools, their way of teaching this new way of life for them, it was never done through lesson plan. There was no teaching. I think that they maybe sat in a classroom for like an hour a day. The rest of the time, they were essentially slaves. They had to get rid of their beautiful traditional clothing. They had to cut their long hair. They were numbered, like everybody was assigned a number like in jail. They weren't allowed to have books. They weren't allowed to sing. They weren't allowed to show affection. Like, even if your own sibling was in this school with you and you hugged them or held their hand, you were beaten. You weren't allowed to laugh. You weren't allowed to play with each other. Like, I cannot even imagine what that would have been like for a child. To be denied, like healthy affection and love is already so emotionally damaging. And then when you couple it with the fact that it was okay for the priests and the nuns to sexually abuse them, what happened was just it's unforgivable. Some of the stories of these survivors, it is so unimaginable, and it's so horrible to think about it actually happening. And I think that's why a lot of people, they just like close themselves off, because your natural instinct is to, protect yourself from anything that makes you uncomfortable or is harmful, to you physically or mentally. So even just hearing about these things, it's not something anybody enjoys doing. So the natural instinct is just to put up that wall, to shut it off, and to tell yourself that it didn't really happen like that. But these children, they were electrocuted. They were tortured through electrocution often. Another method was putting them in buckets of water and then filling those buckets with snakes. Like, where the do you come up with this? But this happened. Like, these are stories that were told in a documentary that I watched. It was made in the 90s, and they told this to a minister named Kevin Annett, and he worked for the United Church. And honestly, what I had mentioned at the beginning of the video about like wanting to wait things out and having reservations about sharing anything was because a lot of the stories that I had read had come from what he was told. And for a long time, I'm sure even still to this day, he's seen as a complete quack. Even though what he was, like shouting from the rooftops, like to look on these residential lands and find these children that are supposed to be there, everybody just brushed him off like that. We've looked, there's nothing there. So much was done to try to silence him. And honestly, I think that he probably will still be seen in a negative light because people don't like to admit when they're wrong, especially people of authority. And a lot of his other beliefs, that don't relate to anything that happened in the residential school, they're not overly mainstream. I can't say that I agree with all of the things that he believes in. But when it comes to the documentary he made and the interviews that were done with people who survived residential schools, and they were called liars, and we now know that what they were saying is true, it makes me wonder if some of those more like outlandish accusations that were made by him might have some truth to them. I want to go through what happened with his whole involvement, and I want to see what you guys think. So he started learning about residential schools after he got a job as a minister at one of the United Churches. And he said it started because he was curious as to why there were never any Indigenous people in the church, but there were a few within that community. So he asked like his superior in the church one day, and he was told they keep to themselves and it's just better that way. So he's a little bit put off by it, but doesn't press too hard, puts a pin in it, and he's like, we'll readdress this at a later date. Fast forward a couple weeks later, he is called to officiate a wedding that is on one of the reserves close by. And he asks the man that he's marrying the same question. And the man just looks at him and he's like, the church is responsible for killing my best friend at the residential school there and burying him in the backyard. And Kevin's like, okay, that is a lot to unpack in one sentence, 2 sentences. But he carries on with the wedding, and he leaves deciding that he's not going to let it go now. He wants to know more and, like what both sides of the story is. He continues with his sermons, and word is kind of spreading that his door is open to everybody, including members of the Indigenous community. So some of them start attending. And he always ended his services with the opportunity for anybody who wanted to share with the congregation. And slowly elders within this community would share stories. Sometimes it would be with the group, and he said, like it wasn't always the most received because, again, they're coming in accusing people who are strong followers that their system is responsible for some really horrible things happening to their people. So he said that he found that a lot of them would stay after and they'd share with him one-on-one. He said as trust is being built and he's learning more and more, a lot of these stories are becoming very similar to the man that he had recently married on the reserve, about children being killed by church officials, by their priests, by the nuns that were running these residential schools. And it just got deeper and deeper when he actually found out how this was all happening. He'd hear about young kids being passed around by these officials and being raped, young girls being impregnated by the priests, little boys being sexually abused by both priests and nuns, newborn babies being born from these rapes and being brought to the furnace room to conceal that there was ever a pregnancy. Just, it's unimaginable. It's unimaginable. And naturally, like I said, you just put this guard up to protect yourself. And that's what Kevin did. Like he felt like it was just so much that it was almost unbelievable. But then there comes a point where when so many people are coming forward and sharing similar stories and they don't even know each other. Like these are different people, different groups, different circles, different ages. When you're hearing the same thing, you know, there's got to be truth behind it. He decides he wants to reach out and see what the perspective is from fellow colleagues again. And he goes to people who he thought were his friends and he's like, this is what I'm being told. Like, this can't be true. But it has to be, because how are this many people coming up with the same story when they don't know each other? Again, he's shut down, and pretty much this time it's much more aggressive. It's like, shut your mouth, be a good minister, stop feeding into this. He doesn't stop though. He continues asking questions, continues to reach out to people in the reserves and within the community. And he wants to give a voice to them and share their stories as an ally. And no surprise, he gets fired from the church. There's not really a reason given. It's just like point blank, you're not a good fit. Even though 90% of the people that attended his services gave him a high approval rating, he's told if he wants to return back to his job and remain a minister within the United Church, he would need to go through retraining and undergo psychic evaluation. Psychic evaluation for believing people's stories of surviving residential schools. Apparently, if you believe it, you're psychotic. Next, he said they went through any length they could to silence him by ruining his life. They personally reach out to his wife and they tell her that they will grant her a divorce, which is normally a big no-no, but they're willing to make the exception since, you know, he's off on the beaten path and very unstable. Eventually, she does divorce him and gains custody of their children. He's made to look like a lunatic to all of his colleagues, anybody who remains active in the church. He lost his career, he lost his friends, he lost family, all because he's asking questions and simply wondering, where did these missing children go? It's mind-blowing the lengths that were taken to prevent him from finding answers. I would recommend checking out his documentary called Unrepentant. It's on YouTube, and it's a documentary he did years ago, and I do feel like it deserves a lot more eyes and attention since it was criticized for so long. I mean, this was something that was looked at as some whack job that put a documentary together out of, like, you know, pulling shit out of his ass, all because he was seeking retaliation to the church for being fired from his job. That's the way that it was presented. I will say it is quite old, so some of the terms we have evolved from, but I really feel like the intentions were coming from a good place, not to like be derogatory or anything like that, so just keep that in mind. But it is worth checking out because you get to personally see and hear first count stories from some of these survivors, and it just helps put into perspective even more what they went through when you can hear it from somebody personally. It's really heavy. You will hear about the murder of Maisie Shaw, who was a young girl who died on December 24th, 1946. She was killed when her principal, Alfred Caldwell, kicked her down the stairs and she broke her neck. You'll hear from survivors who heard the screams of the babies that were being born from young girls after being impregnated by the priests, who were taken to a furnace room, and all they heard was agonizing cries, which they still hear to this day. You'll hear first-person accounts of the attempts of genocide inflicted on them by spreading smallpox within the Indigenous community and trying to make it look like it was like a natural wipeout. I learned that one of the ways they did this was taking blankets from hospitals where patients were being treated for smallpox or dying from smallpox, and the hospitals would give these blankets to the missionaries, and they would take this to the Indigenous communities. And this was like, these were the blankets that were being used for these smallpox patients. And then when these blankets were being used within their community, smallpox just started spreading like wildfire. One community actually went from 3,000 people to 44. They did the same thing with tuberculosis in the schools. One thing these survivors share is that they were forced to play and sleep in the same room as these children who were dying of, tuberculosis or smallpox. And then when they got it, they were denied any medical attention. And these children knew that their classmates were dying of this disease and that it was deadly. They knew the sick ones were supposed to be isolated and everyone should stay away from them to remain healthy, but they were forced to, and if they didn't, they were beaten. Again, it's just heartbreaking knowing that they were forced to do something that they knew was harmful to them and had a really high chance of killing them, and they had no choice in the matter. 50% of children in residential schools would die every year from tuberculosis. Another way that this genocide was inflicted was through sterilization. Many women were taken forcefully out of their houses and given injections, they said, and they would wake up dazed in a hospital, and they would be in horrible pain and covered in bruises. And years later, when they would try to conceive and they were having troubles and they would go and, look for answers, they were told they were sterilized and couldn't have children. Men also went through a sterilization process when they were young, often having to go through repeated X-ray exposure sessions where the machine would be directly over their pelvis for 10 to 20 minutes at a time. Like there's no other explanation there. You weren't screening for a broken wrist. It's just enraging because one thing that I am seeing a lot of, it's just like excuses and a lot of skepticism, like, oh, did it really happen? Like they wouldn't put an X-ray machine on them for that it wasn't for the purpose of sterilization. Another really popular phrase right now is, yeah, it did happen, but it was a part of Canada's dark history. This is it's a way to avoid full acceptance and almost lessen the severity, because it's like, well, yeah, we wouldn't do that now. Things are different today. And it's like, no. Yes, these schools started in 1867, but the last one closed in 1996. 1996. I was 10 years old. It's just hard to wrap my head around the fact that there are a lot of people who don't think that the Indigenous community is marginalized and they don't experience systematic racism. They shouldn't be affected by this dark history, today. And that mindset just shows that there's a lot of work that needs to be done, a lot that needs to be understood of what people went through and how that trickled into the next generation of children that were born to these survivors of these schools. One of the stories that I saw, it broke my heart because it was from one of the survivors, and she said, putting all of the physical and mental abuse aside, one thing that she struggled so much with and hurt her the most was that it took her so long to be able to know how to love and just simply say the words, I love you, to her children. And I mean, there's been many studies on this. This is proven that if children aren't shown love and attention, the consequences of it are very, very traumatizing. You see a lot of these survivors struggle with addiction issues, and I think it's important to understand where that came from and just have that compassion of knowing that turning turning to a substance to drown out effects of post-traumatic stress syndrome, hearing screams of children, watching and seeing your friends, seeing them be murdered in front of you, like literally bleeding in front of you, and you have to go and dig a grave. For so many people, the only way that they can cope is to drown it out with drugs or alcohol. It's also why the suicide rate within Indigenous communities is astonishingly high. And what really speaks to the character of so many of these survivors and their children and families is all they want is for acknowledgement of what happened from those that were involved. The institutions that were involved, meaning the RCMP, the church, the government, and admitting that what happened was carried out in an attempt to wipe them out. You know, not just mistreatment or the way things were then or dark history. Like, no, just call a spade, say what happened. Recognize that it was a part of what the institution that you are involved with did. Doesn't mean that it's your belief today. It just means that you acknowledge that it happened and things need to be better, and they're not liars, and that death within their community matters just as much as it does any other. I wanted to read a little bit from a post that I came across on Facebook from a child of a residential school survivor and his story, so that if you don't end up watching the documentary and hearing first-hand accounts, you can get a sense through this writing what I'm talking about and just kind of put it into perspective and just give a little bit more reality to the situation. So this was written by one of the survivor's daughters. It says that when he was 4 years old, he was taken from his home at gunpoint by the RCMP. They came with government papers telling them that the Indian children had to attend residential school. He said the whole trip he cried alongside a whole wagon full of Native children from his community. Some of these children were in handcuffs. He spent 10 years of his childhood from age 4 to 14 being sexually abused by both priests and nuns. Children would go to sleep at night crying themselves to sleep because they'd be plucked out of their bed every night to be sexually and physically abused. They had their hair cut off. They'd be physically abused if they spoke the Cree language. Some kids left and they were never heard from again. Roughly 6,000 Native children died in residential schools from disease, beatings, firing squads, malnutrition, electrocution, newborns born of by the priests who were thrown into the furnace. There were also those who either froze to death or died of starvation while attempting to run home to their loved ones. This left her father sexually confused and mentally scarred with identity crisis, shame, self-hatred, loss of language and culture, suicidal thoughts, substance abuse, anger issues, and basically all of the isms in the dictionary that led him to doing time in jail when he would try to stand up for himself or others against injustices like racism, inequality, oppression, etc., etc. The residential schools took the children from the land to disconnect people from their culture in order to take the land from the children. The genocide is ongoing. We still see the constant removal of Indigenous children from their ancestral lineages. One of the worst and most powerful things on this earth is to look in a mother's eyes and see the pain she experiences when she has that which she loves most in this world taken away from her. It leaves mental scars and trauma that she'll never forget. It destroys lives. It destroys families. It's a form of cultural genocide, and it happens way too much in our communities. We need to recognize this as a form of oppression and as a calculated effort by our colonizers to create dysfunction within our communities to maintain control of the land and exploitation of natural resources. Our ancestors have endured so much injustice, from invasion, genocide, attempted extermination, racism, forced assimilation, abuses of all kinds, hatred, made outcasts in our own land, looked down upon by people of other races since 1492 at the hands of our invaders, and we are still here. I've come across a lot of stories like this week, and then it reminded me of the story that I read from another survivor who, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, their story has been spun into a conspiracy theory because his accounts involve the Queen and Prince Philip. This story was told by a residential school survivor named William Coombs, and he was a survivor of the Kamloops residential school, which is where they just found those children, 215 children, last week. A testimony that he shared was that on October 10th, 1964, while the Queen was on a Canadian visit, she and Prince Philip came to the Kamloops school. He says he thought it was a little bit weird because there was no like attention or like parade. It wasn't mentioned that she was coming, whereas in like other areas of the country there had been. But he doesn't think too much of it. He was actually kind of excited because they got to wear new clothes and they had like a big dinner the night before their arrival. So everything was like all good. He said when they arrived the next day, some children were introduced to them and then they were brought on a picnic. He said during this picnic, 10 students were chosen to go on a walk with the Queen and Prince Philip. He said it was 7 boys and 3 girls, and after an extended amount of time, only she and Prince Philip returned. The 10 children never came back and they were never seen again. This is just one part of his story that he shared. The rest of it is very similar to the story that I just shared that daughter wrote about her father. And he is also one of the survivors who has been, pleading alongside Kevin Annett to conduct searches on the grounds because he had witnessed children being buried there. And he was just disregarded and shoved off as, insane. And for years, his story in particular has been fake news or conspiracy theory. And I mean, I can see where the line can be crossed because there's speculation as to what happened to those 10 children that has taken on like a life of its own because we don't know. One of the more popular assumptions is that they were used as a sacrifice. But this was never insinuated by William. He just simply said that they left and that they never came back. But what fueled this sacrifice thing was that 10 days before he was actually supposed to make a formal statement under oath, he died suddenly. So naturally, anytime something like that happens, it's just like, see, this he was going to say this, he was going to share this, and that's why he was taken care of. My view on William's story is that up until 2 weeks ago, he was dismissed as a part of, this embellished version of what happened at the residential schools, and that there was no proof of any bodies being buried, and that he hadn't seen anything, and that children were not purposely killed by the church. Now, though, with these discoveries, it validates his claims. So if everything else that he said in his statement is true, why would he just add this one piece of his long story if it wasn't, he didn't just come out with a statement saying this is what happened on this day with the Queen. He had a long story like the one that I just shared where he basically shares the same things, and then he also had this piece within that story as well. So I feel like, if everything else matches, why would he just make the one part up? He might not. I don't think that it had to do with human sacrifice, though. I think it makes more sense to be tied into child migrant rings that were going on up until the late 1970s. This primarily took place in the UK, where children from orphanages or poor families, they were taken and sent to work hard labor, mostly in Australia and in Canada, and they also suffered extreme abuse. But what makes me think that it has a tie there is that when I read stories from those survivors who again have no connection or attachments to anybody within the residential school system, they're from the UK, they don't know each other, but their stories started off as we were told we were going on a picnic. You can't make this stuff up, okay? I guess you could, but these people didn't know William Coombs. They didn't know him. These are stories published from different journalists. I don't have any reason to believe that this was all concocted together in different years. And yeah, I don't think that it's just some big conspiracy theory involving these picnic trips. And I do feel like the royals knew about it, because when some of these parents would share their stories, it often went that they had dropped off their children at these orphanages, and the intention was that they needed to get on their feet and they were going to be coming back for their children. So they needed them to be somewhere, and cared for until they were able to do it themselves. And then by the time that they came back for their children, they were gone. And one account I read from a mother was that this happened to her. She went to go get her son. He was gone, and they were basically like, oh yeah, sorry, like we can't get him back. And she was desperate to get her child back. And so she writes to the Queen Mother and shares her story and gets a reply back that's basically like, yeah, sorry, nothing we can do. So when I read that this was happening within the UK, it made more sense to me and makes me feel like there probably is some truth to what William said. Again, there's no way of knowing what really happened, and we can't confirm that they ever came. There's no documentation that is remaining that they were ever there, but we couldn't confirm that children were buried on the land up until like 2 weeks ago. So, we might be able to in the future. I think what we can all agree on is there is much more that needs to be uncovered here. Every single child needs to be brought home. I don't want this to turn into something that's acknowledged and there's an apology and then it's like, okay, we've done our part, and it just stops at finding these 215 children. There needs to be every effort made to bring back home the rest of these babies that are missing. I want to make note that this does go so much deeper than just the residential schools. We have huge injustice that's going on with our missing and murdered Indigenous women. I am working on putting a video together for that. I have been for a long time, but it's something that I've been waiting to film once we hit 100,000 subscribers. And I want to do it that way because I want more exposure to the story. Our channel is we're still new, guys, and growing nicely, and I'm so thankful for all of you. You guys are so supportive and just like so ride or die, and always sharing my channel with people within, like the true crime groups that you're in or your friends and family. And I mean, it just means so much to me. And I know that we're gonna get to 100,000. I hope we do it soon. But that's been my long goal, is that I want to share what's going on there. And originally I was going to, touch a little bit on it here, but I just feel like both stories deserve their own space. They deserve their own time. And for today's, I just couldn't wait to talk about the residential schools. So I hope that as the channel continues to grow, new people will start binging and come across this video and watch it and just come out from it learning something new and maybe something that they didn't know before. That's my hope and intention here. To members of our Indigenous community, I just want you to know that you have an ally in me, and I will continue to educate myself so that I can be better and stronger in my support for you. All right, you guys, that is it for me today. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It means the world to me. I love and I appreciate you so much. I will see you in the next video, and I'll miss you terribly. Until then, make sure to love each other, love yourself, and I will see you soon. Bye.